the virtual last year. But we're hoping that next year we will be back in the field. So before we get started with our presentations today, a few housekeeping rules that I think most people are probably pretty familiar with at this point. Your microphone should be muted. If you have unmuted it, please go ahead and turn it back to mute. And also please turn off your cameras just to minimize the distraction factor while our presenters are speaking. There's going to be a question and answer session after all the presentations have ended. We're not going to do questions at the end of each presentation. We're going to go all through the 3 presentations and then take questions at the end. So if at any point during the webinar you do have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat box, and then we will address it at the end. Hopefully we'll have enough time for everything. At the end of all 3 presentations, I'm going to put up a slide that has all of our speakers' contact information on it, so you can jot it down or take a picture of it, so that if you have additional questions after the webinar ends, you can reach out to the speakers individually. And then our webinar is being recorded, and we will upload it to our NCPCA, NC Pollinator Conservation Alliance YouTube channel within the next week or so. And we'll also send out a notification through Eventbrite when it has been uploaded, so that you will know and you can go there. So just a really brief background about our organization. We are a partnership of about 27 agencies and organizations that kind of ebbs and flows, but we all have the same interest in pollinator outreach and conservation across North Carolina. And within this partnership, we have 6 active committees, to include the Plant Resources Committee, Habitat Assessment, Research, Energy, and Pesticide Stewardship. And then our Outreach Committee is the committee that is bringing you this webinar today. And if you want to learn more about us, we have a website, www.ncpollinatoralliance.org. And we're also on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So with that, this is a quick overview of some of our partners, so you can see that we're pretty diverse. We have a lot of federal and state agencies. We also have NGOs and academic background, and then we have some private industries involved. So our agenda for today, I'm going to hand it over to Debbie in just a minute, but Debbie Roos from the NC Cooperative Extension is going to kick us off and talk about the top 25 native pollinator plants in North Carolina. And then Drs. Elsa Youngstead and Hannah Levinson from NC State are going to give a close-up look at native bees and give you some identification information, as well as some background on diversity. And then we're going to wrap it up with Lewis Cobble from NCDA in Consumer Services, and he's going to talk about pesticide misuse inside and outside of hives and how to avoid it. So Debbie, I'm going to stop sharing, and then you can go ahead and get your presentation loaded.
Okay, thanks. And if Gabriella, if you can take over letting people in from the waiting room, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
Let me go ahead and share. Okay, I'm starting my timer. Let's see. Let's get it going here. Oh, here we go. Wait a minute. Can y'all see that? Does that look good, Gabriella?
Yep, you're
okay.
Good.
Thank you. So as Gabriella said, we're each given 20 minutes, and that is quite a challenge for some of us wordy people. So this is going to be fairly quick, but give you an overview of my top 25 native pollinator plants. And this is coming from my experience with the Pollinator Paradise Demonstration Garden. This is a cooperative extension project that I created back in 2008 here in Pittsburgh. It's a showcase demonstration garden that I use for teaching folks about both pollinators and pollinator habitat. And it's grown, the garden has grown over the years to feature over 225 species of plants, and 85% of them are native to North Carolina. So I'm not only trying to teach people about pollinator habitat and pollinators, but also because we manage the garden organically, I use it to teach about organic gardening techniques and also the value of native plants. The garden is open to the public 24/7, so I'll give you more information later on how to visit it. And I do have the wonderful help of a small group of volunteers to help me in that garden. And this is showing you where Chatham County is for those of you who are maybe not from the area. So how did I choose my top 25? And to be clear, this is Debbie's top 25. It may not be, Hannah's or Gabriella's, but this is based on my experience working, with this demo garden for 14 years. So some of the criteria I used, I did focus on native plants. So these are all plants that are native to North Carolina. I wanted the plants to be obviously highly attractive, beautiful plants to both people, but also pollinators. Not all plants are created equal in their attractiveness to pollinators or their value to pollinators. These are plants that I have observed and managed for 13, 14 years. So they've got a proven track record and they offer multiple seasons of interest. So not just during that bloom period, which is going to be fairly long to make it onto this list, but also offer benefits at least 3 out of the 4 seasons of the year, if not 4. Also, there's a lot of plants out there that I'm pretty obsessed with, but I'm also sometimes reluctant to tell people about them because they're not going to be able to find them in a local nursery, or they're going to be difficult to find. So the ones that made it on this list tend to be plants that I feel sure with a little bit of searching, you'll be able to find. Before I get into the nitty gritty of what those plants are, just some basic principles for pollinator habitat for y'all to consider. For pollinators, you want to have plants blooming from early spring to late fall. I do like to encourage people to emphasize native plants because they have a lot more value to wildlife in general. And you want to include a diversity of flowers because that helps attract that diversity of pollinators that have different foraging habits and different tongue lengths. For example, different nesting habits, excuse me. So you want different colors, shapes, and sizes of blooms. You want to have plants that are workhorse plants that provide multiple benefits throughout the year. And once you find a plant that's highly attractive to pollinators, I like to include more than one species of that. For example, a milkweed or an aster or a goldenrod. You want to make sure and include plants in your habitat that are host plants for butterflies. So you'll have lots of caterpillars coming to feed on the plants. And then it's always a great idea to include native grasses. It may not be the obvious choice for pollinators because it doesn't have that, conspicuous a bloom, but actually some native grasses can be host plants for butterflies. But more importantly, they provide structure for the garden and also very important nesting and shelter for wildlife. So let's get into the plants. And by the way, when I'm done with my presentation, I will provide some links to the website in the chat. I can't do it while I'm talking. And you'll be able to download my top 25 pollinator plant list from the website. So, and it's broken down into the different seasons, spring, summer, and fall. So let's look at some of my favorite spring bloomers. Spiderwort is on the list. It's a plant that tends to bloom both in the spring and then rebloom in the fall. It's happy in part shade. But it can also handle full sun, although it will go dormant in the summer. So here's some nice, beautiful blue spiderwort mixed with a viburnum shrub. You'll find lots of bumblebees and leafcutter bees, and in this case, a honeybee that love the spiderwort. Now, it will seed in fairly aggressively. So it is a plant that you'll have to manage, meaning you might have to, dig it up and relocate some of them or share with your friends. Okay, the next plant on the list, and actually this is a new addition. After many years, I finally bumped another plant from the list just so I could add this one, Bluestar Amsonia tabernaemontana. This is a plant that has 3 seasons of interest. It's just a beautiful, when it's in bloom, here it is. It's closely related to the Arkansas Bluestar, which I also have in the garden. The Arkansas Bluestar has a thinner leaf, but they're both equally beautiful. But this gorgeous sky blue bloom in the spring, and the foliage looks great all summer. And then here's a close-up of the blooms. And here's a leafcutter bee enjoying that. And then the neat thing is in the fall, it gives you another show when the foliage turns yellow. Now, I think I'm giving my secrets away here because I noticed when I finished my presentation that I had way more pictures of wild indigo than I did of the others. So it is definitely, if I had to do a top 10 list, wild indigo would make it on there. This is the Baptisia. I have multiple species in the garden and also different cultivars, but the straight species tend to be either blue, white, or yellow, or blue purple. It does like full sun. Now, the one thing I will caution about this, I consider it to have 3 seasons of interest as well, like the Amsonia. But the interesting thing about Baptisia, it has no winter presence. It's not there at all, which means if you have a big grouping of them, you're going to have a big gap in your garden with nothing there. So I would not encourage you to put too many of them together, but mix, spread them apart so you don't have a big open space in your garden. But here it is. It's beloved by bumblebees and leafcutter bees, and it provides that really important early season bloom. And here's the white one, Baptisia alba, which is just gorgeous and blooms a little bit later typically. Here's the hybrid Baptisia mixed with the Amsonia I was just telling you about, which is just gorgeous. And this is the Carolina Moonlight cultivar of the Baptisia. It's just beautiful. And again, the foliage looks great when it's done blooming. Here's the purple smoke mixed with some golden Alexander. And then here's an American bumblebee on that Carolina Moonlight bloom. And then it has these really nice seed pods when they dry in the fall, and the wind blows, it sounds like a rattle. So I always am dragging people over to listen to that when in the fall, when you can hear that. But really nice 3 seasons of interest. Another favorite is the beard tongue. I have a couple of different species of penstemon in the garden, typically purple or white. Here's a sweat bee and a bumblebee on the foxglove beard tongue, the penstemon digitalis. And this is the Smalls penstemon or beard tongue, penstemon smallii. I mean, just look inside that bloom. It's just so cool in there. And you'll see bumblebees, especially, and honeybees enjoying that. Golden Alexander is another spring bloomer. Zizia aurea blooms in the spring. It may rebloom a little bit in the fall. And kind of the neat thing about this is not only is it very attractive to pollinators, the flowers, but the foliage is a native host for the black swallowtail caterpillar that you typically see on your dill and your parsley and your fennel. Purple coneflowers I have listed as a spring bloomer, but they actually will bloom all the way into fall. Again, multiple species of this, but also many different cultivars. And you'll find, just gorgeous flowers of different colors if you have different cultivars, and a lot of different pollinators enjoying them. Here's an American lady butterfly. This is a site you can see right now in the pollinator garden, the coneflowers with the Culver's root and the Liatris. I love the Gaillardias, the Lanceleaf Blanketflowers. They will bloom spring to fall as well if you keep them deadheaded. Different cultivars, the yellows and the burgundies are just gorgeous. And that is one that we keep deadheaded, so it will keep blooming. Here's some purple one mixed with coneflower. The Stokes Aster, Stokesia laevis, is an evergreen. It's blooming right now in full bloom. I love the Peachy's Pick cultivar, and it's just beautiful. A big bloom, periwinkle blue. Here's a leafcutter bee on that same species. Bee balms, we have several different bee balm species in the garden, and they can, be a little spready but easy to control. I do love the Claire Grace cultivar because I find that one to be the most powdery mildew resistant. And again, it's in full bloom right now in the garden and attracts a lot of different pollinators. New Jersey tea is a really great choice for a late spring, early summer blooming deciduous shrub. White bloom, and here it is. It's just beautiful, and it can handle part shade. A lot of these plants can handle part shade. Here's a close-up. It's a real bumblebee magnet, but actually attracts quite a diversity of different types of different species of pollinators. Now we're going to move into the summer blooming. I'm doing a time check here. We're doing good. So Blazing Star is one of my favorites. I have several species. I listed one here, Liatris baccata, but I have multiple species. It's a really tall plant, but because it's got a narrow profile, we call that a see-through plant, so you can see past it, which means you can put it at the front, of the bed if you want. Here's a monarch enjoying the Liatris, a sweat bee, and here's some Liatris mixed with coneflowers and poppy mallow. Mountain mint, again, would make a top 10 list if I had to do it. I've got 6 or 8 species, I can't remember, of native mountain mint. Can somebody turn off the, no, whatever, somebody's drawing on the slides. So again, attracts a tremendous diversity of pollinators. On any one plant, you'll see, bees and wasps and butterflies and all kinds of things. This is the Virginia mountain mint. And here's a buckeye on that same species of mountain mint. Milkweed is, again, highly attractive. I've got 10 native species of milkweed in the garden. Each one kind of has its own niche. Some like it hot and dry, some like part shade, some like, moisture soil. But, of course, we include this not only for the bees, but also because it's a host plant for the monarchs. This is one of the carpenter mimic leafcutter bee, swamp milkweed, bumblebee. Just showing you some of the different species we have in the garden. So just wonderful. Some have very narrow leaves, some have coarse leaves, giving lots of options for our pollinators. One of my favorites is the Culver's root. It loves moist soil if you have it, but it does fine with regular dry soil. Veronicastrum virginicum. It's got this candelabra-like flower. It's in peak bloom right now. And it's tall and blooms for a couple of months, and just beloved by a lot of the different bees and butterflies. Boneset is a relative of Joe Pye weed, Eupatorium perfoliatum. Again, long blooming. I like things that don't flop. And I just love it because it blooms for a very long time, and it's just gorgeous. That really interesting Joe Pye ageratum type flower. The great blue lobelia, you're probably more familiar with the red cardinal flower, its cousin, but this one does better in full sun. The cardinal flower prefers kind of moisture soil with part shade, but this is a great plant to include in the garden. And Rattlesnake Master, I like really weird flowers. This is a one of those, architectural, very prickly, white bloom. Again, attracts a tremendous diversity of pollinators, all on the same plant at the same time. It only has the disc flowers, not the ray flowers, or what we call petals. Just beautiful to include wherever you can. Again, very architectural, just a lovely sight, and will be covered in different types of insects. Another excellent shrub to include is the St. John's wort, Hypericum frondosum, especially loved by the bumblebees and the honeybees. This is one of our medicinal plants, and just has a really cool bloom, and it's kind of in peak bloom or finishing up peak bloom right now. Okay, this is a bonus plant. It's not on my top 25, but I just love it so much. Even though a lot of people just think of this as a weedy weed, but it is just the most amazing flower. It is weedy, it will seed in, but it's really easy to pull out. And I love it because it's a beautiful flower. It's a medicinal and an edible plant. And, especially the carpenter bees and the honeybees love it. So here's some like carpenter bees, like holding hands. It's like whenever you see carpenter bees with that thorax covered in pollen, you know that you have passion flower blooming in the area. And here it is mixed with the obedient plant. We also have a yellow species called Passionflower lutea. That flower is about the size of a quarter. And here's a katydid wasp foraging at the yellow passion flower. And again, passion flower is an important host plant for butterflies like the variegated fritillary. Another one of my all-time favorite shrubs is a buttonbush. It's known as a wetland plant, but trust me, I do not have wet soils at the garden, so it does quite well in average soil. It blooms for 4 months or more. So it attracts a lot of different pollinators. Really interesting bloom, that spiky bloom. This is the little florets before they open, and it provides important seed for the birds. Okay, doing a time check again. Woohoo, better speed it up. Joe Pye weed, another great plant. Summer bloomer. A lot of people call it a fall bloomer, but for me, it blooms in the summer. You can see it's very attractive to a lot of different things like butterflies and also a number of bees, and you'll see a lot of predators and other beneficials hunting on the canopy as well. Okay, some fall blooming. Yep, we're doing good. We're in the home stretch here, just in time. So don't forget those fall bloomers. So there's some things like your asters. I've got about 12 species of native aster in the garden. So I do that, 12 species of aster. I've got 12 species of goldenrod. So that really lengthens the bloom season. So it means my goldenrod starts blooming in July and goes through October or even later. So again, each of these asters has a different growth habit, different shape or color of the flower, different size of the flower. This is the common aromatic aster. This is the Eastern silvery aster, completely different growth habit. This is the frost aster, little pea-sized white flower. So lots of diversity out there. And goldenrods, again, lots of diversity in goldenrods. This is the Solidago fireworks, the rough goldenrod. This one is a really beautiful white goldenrod, Solidago bicolor. And here's just an example of some of the many different types of species you can see and find in the nurseries. Ironweed is another great one. I've got several species of ironweed. Most of them are typically quite tall, but I have a shorter one called Vernania lettermanii, or cutleaf ironweed. And this is a shorter one also called stemless ironweed. So lots of diversity in the ironweeds as well. And here's a sunflower bee on an ironweed bloom. The Monarda punctata, the Eastern horseman, is a nice late summer fall bloomer. There's a little honeybee tucked up in there. The wasps love to visit it, and you'll see a lot of predators and green link spiders and such not. The last plant on the list is the climbing aster. This is a woody vine. It's really great because it blooms really late. And I experimentally tried planting it as a shrub to see how it would do, and it did really well. So this is the climbing aster as it's reaching above a trellis. It's just a beautiful late bloomer. It'll bloom all the way into the winter if it's a mild enough winter. This is again the vine on a trellis, and we prune it back pretty hard several times in the spring, and then let it go. And here's a long-tailed skipper enjoying those blooms. And this is the vine planted as a shrub. So you can see it does quite well, pruned as a shrub. So I've got a lot of information on my website. As soon as I'm done, I will put the link in the chat. I've done virtual garden tour videos. So even if you can't make it to the garden, you can watch my videos. I have some from last year, and I'm continuing to do them this year every month. And so I'm featuring, highlighting my favorite plants and pollinators for that particular month. I've got a list of all the plants in the garden, all 225 species. And then I've got the shorter top 25 list. I am doing in-person tours. I did one this morning for people in the rain. These gardeners didn't mind getting a little rain. They are filling up really fast. I've done them, 12, 13 of them, for the spring and summer. I'll post more for the fall. So if you see them, you need to sign up fast. I also do private tours for groups of 10 or more. I think one of the most helpful things on the website is what I call the What's in Bloom list. So every 2 weeks I go around and record what's blooming that week. So that identifies plants for you. Because I don't have everything labeled at the garden. It is open 24/7 to the public. You can go there at any time, but don't expect to see all the plants identified. But use the website. And then I've got nursery seed suppliers. I've also got links to helpful fact sheets and all kinds of stuff. And Gabriella, I've got 10 seconds left. I can't believe it. And I guess we're holding the questions though. So.
Yep, we're holding the questions. That was awesome, Debbie. Thank you.
Sorry.
All right, great job, Debbie. That was awesome. I always love looking at your pictures. But we'll move right along. So Elsa and I are doing this next section, and we'll talk about native bees, diversity and identification. And I have a couple slides at the beginning just to introduce us to what we're going to talk about. And then we'll move into some live bee and other insect identification. Yeah, so bees are an extremely diverse group of insects. You can see from this picture, they come in all shapes, sizes, and colors, which makes them really fun to work with, but it can also make them pretty hard to work with and hard to learn to identify. So in North Carolina, we have about 560 different species of bees that are present in our state. In North America, there are more than 4,000, and there are more than 20,000 in the world. So they can all live different ways, eat different things. There's a lot going on there. And something I like to talk about and bring up at this point is that a lot of times when people use the word bee, they use that kind of as a shortcut to refer to a honeybee. I did my PhD work in a honeybee lab. We're guilty of this. We definitely did that. But I want to encourage people to be more specific and intentional when talking about bees, because the word bee refers to all 20,000 species in the world. All of these are bees, and honeybees are just one, sorry about that, are just one species out of the 20,000. So to move on and talk to you about their diversity a little bit. Bees are very diverse in where they live. There are 4 main categories of how we group with where they build their nests. The first is in soil. So they will bury straight down into the soil, build a tunnel, and then make these little cells off of the main tunnel where they lay their eggs. And about 70% of all bee species in the world live underground, and you might not even know that they're there. Some species nest in wood. It could be sound wood or it could be rotting wood. Other species nest in stem and twigs, and then others nest in cavities. These are most often the honeybees and bumblebees that we're all familiar with, but they're actually a very small percentage of the 20,000 species in the world live in cavities. Even though that's what we're all most familiar with, the majority live underground in the soil. They're also diverse in what they eat. So on one side of the spectrum, we have specialist pollinators, which means that they need very specific plants in order to successfully raise their young. So this example here is a squash bee visiting a squash flower. Squash bees are specialists and need to get pollen from these squash flowers to successfully raise their young. Some specialists can visit a family of plants, others a specific species of plant. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have generalist pollinators, where if a plant produces nectar or pollen, they can successfully collect resources from it and be just fine. And there's something in between. It's a gradient, really. Bees are also diverse in when they are active, what time of year. So these are just a few examples. I won't go into full detail, but just to show you the months of the year are listed along this x-axis. And you can see that some species emerge in early February and March. Others are active all the way through to December, some kind of constant throughout the whole year. So not all bees are present at all times of the year. So you might be thinking, there's so much going on. Why is it important to know an identity of a bee? And there's a lot of reasons. So like I mentioned, they live different places. So you need to know the identity of the bee in order to know how to best support it, what nesting resources it needs. Similarly, with the food it eats, they eat different things, so we can learn how we can protect their populations. We can also use different species as indicator of environmental health because they all need different things and live different places. Some are more sensitive than others. It's a way to appreciate how important they are economically and ecologically. They're great pollinators for our crops, but also for our natural areas, and it's a great way to connect to nature. So now we're going to move into the IDing. I have a few introductions. I'll go really quick. So the first thing that we won't talk about live, but remember they are active at different times of the year. So that's a trick you can use. If you see where a plant it's visiting or where it's nesting, that's another trick you can use. And then what we're about to talk about now is you first want to identify, are you actually looking at a bee? If it is, where is it carrying its pollen? And then what hair patterning and color and size is it? So that's where we're going to start with the live identifying now. So I'll switch our views really quickly and find, where is the, oh my gosh, there's so many people. Hold on, I'm trying to find the iPad. Do any of the other hosts, oh, here it is, I see it. Spotlight for everyone, okay.
Okay. Okay, cool. So Hannah is going to guide us through, oops, I need to actually start the timer. Hannah is going to show us some specimens. We've been using the word live, but by live we mean in real time, not actually alive. They're on pins, which is how we identify most of our bees that we look at. That's what you need to really get them to species, but we're going to show you a few characteristics that you can use to recognize bees in the field. And of course, being 560 species, you're not going to learn every single one, but we'll look at some of the characteristics that can help you tell bees from other insects and from each other. So starting with telling bees from other insects, there are a lot of really convincing lookalikes out there, and this is one of them that Hannah is showing right now. And this is actually a flower fly, also known as a syrphid fly or a hoverfly. And they really can look very bee-like when you see them on flowers. They often have that same coloration, but there are a few things to cue in on to decide whether what you're seeing is a fly or a bee. First thing is the eyes. This fly, you can see the eyes take up pretty much the entire head. They are enormous. That's a sure sign of a fly and not a bee. It also has very teeny little bristle-like antennae in between those eyes. You can barely even see them even under this view. They're just these little teeny antennae. Bees will have much longer antennae. And then the third feature is a little harder to see in the field, but flies have only 2 wings, bees have 4. And sometimes you can spot that and it'll complete the giveaway. So that was our fly. There are also some wasps who can be very bee-like, and some bees can be very wasp-like. This group is honestly trickier to tell apart once you get down to it. And the real giveaway, once you get them under a microscope, is that bees will have branched hairs somewhere on their body and wasps won't. You can't see that in the field, so what are you looking for? The main thing is bees tend to be fuzzier and have bulkier hind legs. That they use, most bees use their hind legs to carry pollen, and this wasp has rather skinny hind legs, even though her other features are bee-like. She does have long antennae, she does have 4 wings, but those back legs couldn't carry more than a couple of grains of pollen. So this is a wasp. And then can you show her face too, Hannah? I don't know if we can see those shiny hairs. The wasps that you're most likely to mistake for bees often have some metallic shiny hairs on their faces that bees will never have. And then let's have a look at a real bee to complete the comparison. So this is an actual bee at last. This is a bumblebee, of course, and a queen, no less. And so she has all of those bee characteristics that those other 2 insects didn't have. She has smaller eyes. She has nice long antennae, which are a little tough to see here because they're kind of folded up. If she were alive, you could see them moving around. She's also very fuzzy, and then her hind legs are very expanded. You can see a flat sort of shiny area where she would pack the pollen onto those back legs, unlike the skinny hind legs of a wasp. And so once you know that what you're looking at is a bee, there are a few characteristics you can use to tell different groups of bees apart from each other. And one of which is where they carry pollen. So we just saw that bumblebee queen with her large sort of bulky hind legs. And this is what those legs look like when she's actually packed them full of pollen. So that area on her hind leg is called a corbicula or a pollen basket. Basket, I think, is always sort of deceptive. It's just like a flat area with a fence of bristles around it, and she packs the pollen in there. She moistens the pollen to pack it on there, so it always forms this sort of tidy clump on her hind legs. So if you see pollen being carried in this way, you have either a bumblebee or a honeybee, period. If you're in North Carolina, no other bees do this, which is useful because there's a lot of other bees who look like bumblebees but carry their pollen in a different way, which is what you will see next. Next, we're going to actually look at a sunflower bee, and they carry their pollen in what's called a scopa, which is just a brush of hairs all over the hind leg. No, she's not focusing yet. Okay. There it is. So this bee, her hind legs are just completely fluffy, covered in hair. That's not even pollen at this point. That's just pollen carrying hairs. So a huge contrast to that flat, shiny hind leg of a bumblebee. And once the bee packs the pollen into these hairs, it's even more striking. She looks like she's just wearing pollen pants because there's pollen all over those hind legs, which you will never see with a bumblebee. And so this is what those hind leg scopa look like when they're packed full of pollen. So this is really distinctive, and there are a lot of bees who look similar to bumblebees, but once you see the pollen all over those back legs, you know that what you've got is not a bumblebee. There's a lot of other things it could be, but not a bumblebee. So that's 2 forms of pollen carrying: corbicula, or a scopa on the legs, and then version 3 is a scopa, or that brush of pollen carrying hairs on the belly. And when you see that, you know you have a bee in the family Megachilidae, which is the leaf cutting, mason, and resin bees. And that's what Hannah is showing us here. And you saw some great pictures of this group in Debbie's talk as well. And they're recognizable by packing their pollen on their belly. It's the only group of bees that does that. So those are the three really obvious ones. And then there are also some tricky bees that can be deceptive. Who's up next? Is this Hylaeus? So some bees actually carry their pollen back to the nest in their stomach or in their crop instead of on the outside of their body. And so these bees can end up looking quite wasp-like. They don't have any big fluffy pollen carrying hairs or obvious pollen. You just kind of have to learn them and know them. And so this Hylaeus or masked bee or yellow-faced bee is an example of that. And you'll see them quite commonly in the summer around here if you keep an eye out. Another important exception is the parasitic bees. These are cuckoo bees who lay their eggs in the nests of other species. And this is a cuckoo bee in the genus Triapiolus. There she goes, she's in focus now. And she'll lay her eggs in the nests of sunflower bees and other longhorn bees. And parasitic bees are incapable of carrying pollen because all they can do is go in another bee's nest. So they also tend to look quite wasp-like, but this bee is very much a bee. And if you zoomed in on her, you would see those branched hairs that all bees have. And then male bees, I think I'm giving you more exceptions than actual examples of these rules of where bees carry pollen. Males don't carry pollen because the females, of course, are doing all the work of nesting and pollen collecting. And so male bees can be a little more wasp-like as well. They don't carry pollen on their bodies, so their hind legs can be a little thinner, but they're just fluffier than sorry, I'm reading the chat and not able to talk. They do tend to be fluffier than wasps, nevertheless. All right, so that's a boy bee, and we'll look a little bit more at the male-female differences in a minute. Another feature that you're going to use to tell bees apart is just color and hair patterning. And so this is an example of a bee where color is a great giveaway. We have several bright green sweat bee species, and this is one of them. They're a little hard to tell apart in the field, but if you see a bee and it's bright green, you know it's a member of the family Halictidae or sweat bees. We also have a couple of entirely black, jet black bees who are pretty recognizable. One of them is up next. This is, and you saw a picture in Debbie's talk as well of this carpenter mimic leafcutter bee. And these bees are active right now. You can see them on anything from sunflowers to black-eyed Susans and more. So this is a very recognizable bee with her jet black body and kind of blue-black wings. So this is the carpenter mimic leafcutter bee. And then both of those species were not stripy at all. They don't fit that sort of classic striped bee image at all. The next one we're going to show you is a stripy bee. This is a sweat bee in the family Halictidae, but of course not a green one. This one's just in the genus Halictus, a fairly generalist little everyday kind of bee, but these will turn up especially on black-eyed Susans, yellow flowers in your garden. So keep an eye out for those strong hair stripes on the abdomen. And these bees are active right now too. And then finally, one more bee whose unique hair pattern and coloration is a dead giveaway to species. This is the morning glory bee, Melatomatoria. So she's got not only those strong hair bands on the abdomen, but also this kind of intricate patterning of gray and black hair on her thorax that's really distinctive and you wouldn't see in any other bee. So these are specialists on morning glory pollen. So if you've got a morning glory patch, keep an eye out for this species. All right, last pair of specimens. We'll talk just a little bit more about the difference between males and females because males, so this is a female carpenter bee, now you're good. And the females do all the work around the nest. So they're the ones who carry the pollen. They tend to be a little bigger. And this carpenter bee female has an all black face. And you'll see in a minute, the males have a lighter colored marking on the face. And that's super obvious in carpenter bees, but fairly common really in most bees. If you see a bee with yellow markings on the face or sort of light colored hairs on the face, a lot of times that's going to be a male. Nobody really knows why they have those light colored markings, but they're a fairly consistent feature of male bees. And then they tend to have the skinnier legs and often bigger eyes and longer antennae, the better to detect the ladies. So I think that's our quick tour of a few bee specimens, and I will turn it back over to Hannah, who will wrap it up, and we have a little quiz for you.
Okay, great. So we're gonna do, just like Elsa said, a quick quiz. I know this is speedy. Hopefully you see the poll on your screen. And in the last 4 minutes of our section, we're gonna try to go over this with all of you. So the first question is, which one is a bee, A, B, or C? And I think we're gonna have to go through all 5 questions and then we'll go back and do the answers. So I'm gonna move a little quickly at first. So we'll go to the next question, which is, which one is a leaf cutting bee, A, B, or C? Give you a couple seconds. Yeah, you can move the poll if it's blocking any of the 3 pictures. Third question, which one is a bumblebee, A, B, or C? Which one is a male, A or B? And then the last one, which one is a sweat bee, A, B, or C? All right, seeing some answers come in. All right, we'll give everyone a little bit more time before we go back through. All right, close the poll. Okay, so we'll go back through the questions. So question 1, which one is a bee? B is the bee, which most of you got. That's great. So you can look for the wing number and the fuzzy hind legs, or where else the pollen collecting hairs are on the body. Question 2, which one is a leaf cutting bee? C is correct. The majority of you got that, so that's great. Question 3, which one is a bumblebee? The majority got this again, A. Great job. A lot of people can confuse A and B, which is a bumblebee and a carpenter bee. So good job on that. 4, which one is a male? You guys killed it again. B is the male, the yellow face. Then the last one, which is a sweat bee. And again, great job. The majority got C is the correct answer. And that giveaway was, this one is a leaf cutter bee, A, because she has hair on her belly. The second is a wasp. It's not very fuzzy. And then the third one has all the characteristics for a sweat bee that we talked about. All right, so that's what we had. Great job, everyone. Okay, and I think it's, oh, perfect timing for Lewis.
All right, here we go. Thank you. And can you guys see my screen okay? We're good?
Yep, you're good.
All right, good. So what a couple of tough acts to follow. I'm not sure if I can live up to that, but I'll do my best. My name is Lewis Cobble. I'm an apiary inspector with the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. And if you're not a beekeeper, you might not even know that apiary inspectors are a thing. And so what we do is help beekeepers understand best management practices. We help diagnose, we look out for and diagnose diseases. and really kind of helping out in the bee world. And so today I want to talk about pesticide misuse inside and outside of the hive and how to avoid it. Many of us, when we think about pesticide misuse, we think about something like this, agricultural spray and bees being exposed through pollination or what have you. And certainly that can be an issue, but there are also misuse issues related to beekeepers that many folks aren't aware of. And in this talk, I'll offer a couple of simple tips to avoid misuse of pesticides, both inside and outside the hive. So why are beekeepers placing pesticides in the hive? So beekeepers rely on miticides to help control a parasitic mite. It's called the varroa mite. And so they reproduce in the developing brood. These mites and the associated viruses are really responsible for most of our honeybee health issues. Certainly when we're talking about trying to get bees from fall through the winter to the next season, in my experience, these mites and the associated viruses are the biggest challenge, and they really, it's the biggest health issue out there for honeybees. And of course, it can be tricky trying to kill a small bug on a big bug. And as you can imagine, but we do have about 10 registered products at the moment. None of them are perfect, but they are important to beekeeping. And there are some misuse issues in our beekeeping world related to these mites on our bees. So inside and outside of the hive. It's really quite simple. How to avoid misuse inside and outside of the hive? Really only use registered products and read and understand and follow the label. So make sure you're using a product that's designed for the job at hand. As an apiary inspector, I usually respond to a couple of pesticide related bee kills each year, and almost always they're a result of someone not using the correct product for the task at hand or not following the label. So maybe they used a product that wasn't registered for what they were trying to do. Maybe they used a cheaper product or another product that had similar active ingredient, but at a different dose. Or they used the correct product, but they didn't bother to read and follow the label. And that's where you can have trouble. So simply using the registered product and following the label can really go a long way to prevent problems. Plenty of effort went into the label so that the product could be used safely and effectively and to minimize risk to the applicator and other off-target species. So it's important to read, understand, and follow that label. Whether you're a beekeeper trying to kill mites or you're a homeowner trying to kill Japanese beetles on your plum tree or whatever, make sure you're using a registered product designed for the task at hand, and make sure you read, understand, and follow the label. And if you need some help understanding the label, certainly reach out to an expert for some help. And so I know that these labels can sometimes be confusing and unclear, but there are experts out there that can help. And so don't be shy about asking for help. And I'll give you some resources here. Here's an example of a label. This label is for a miticide that we would use in a beehive. So just a quick tour of what you might find on a label. Up here is the name of the product. This product is called Apivar. It tells you what it's used for. So this product was designed to be used in a hive to control mites on honeybees. So in a beehive to kill varroa mites, it'll tell you what the active ingredient is. It'll have a section on first aid, precautionary statements, how to store and dispose of the product. And probably one of the most important parts is directions for use, including resistance management. And we'll look a little closer at this section a little later. As far as where to find a label, so I'd like to read the labels before I actually go out and buy the product to make sure that it's going to be appropriate for the use that I have. for the work that I'm trying to do, and make sure that the conditions are correct. And so I like to use, I'll go to the NCDA pesticide webpage, to their pesticide registration page, and click on this NC pesticide registration information link. And that will take you out to another website called the North, it's I think it's run by Kelly Solutions, and they kind of handle the database of registered pesticides in North Carolina. It's a very handy tool to look at and search. You can search by a lot of different, you can search a lot of different ways, including the name of the product or the active ingredient, or by the pest, or EPA registration number. But I certainly like to point beekeepers to this if, or when they're thinking about miticides in the hive. I just say, hey, just click on search by pest, and you can enter varroa mite, and it will return all the products that have been registered for varroa mites in beehives. Now you have to be careful because not all of these are currently registered. So you have to look over in the right-hand column to make sure they're still current. So we notice that this product is no longer registered. So out of all these products, only 10 of them are still registered. But we'll find, let's look at Formic Pro. If we can just click on the Formic Pro link there, and we'll find out who the manufacturer is, what's the active ingredient, where can it be used, and more importantly, you can view the product label. So it'll bring up a PDF of the product label that you can read, and a lot of, especially on a package, this print will be very small, and so I like to read these labels online because I can expand them so that it's not itty bitty print. I can zoom in and get a better. It's a little easier to read. But certainly you can read up on the product and how to use it safely and properly before you actually go up and buy it, which I think is important. Another important resource is the North Carolina Agricultural Chem Manual. You can buy a hard copy of this for $40, but of course it's available online for free. And I think even in chapter 5, they have a list of, they kind of list the toxicity to honeybees of different pesticides. And so this can be a good resource. If you have different options, there'll probably be a lot of different options for whatever you're working on at the moment. And you can refer to the honeybee toxicity list to try to pick the least toxic product that will still be effective for your use. And so this can be a good resource as well. I'm sure the cooperative extension specialist spent a lot of work on this, and they refer to it a lot. It's a very good resource. This is, we're kind of zoomed in on that apivar label and the section on resistance management. Another aspect of some labels includes resistance management. The active ingredient in apivar, amitraz is the active ingredient. It's been an important miticide for the bee industry for a long time, but because of its misuse, I believe we're beginning to see some resistance issues beginning to develop. Resistance is certain to happen with pesticides, but by minimizing misuse, we can extend the useful life of the product, which is important, especially in beekeeping, where we have a very limited arsenal. So we only have 10 products at hand. I was looking at the Kelly registrations for products for fleas on dogs, and there's about 6 pages. There's just a very long list of products available to be used for fleas on dogs, but for mites on bees, very limited number. And so it's important that we don't misuse these products, and so that we can extend their life. Just yesterday, the Honeybee Health Coalition released a document called Guide to Varroa Mite Controls for Commercial Beekeeping Operations. It I think recognizes the kind of the rampant off-label use of amitraz by commercial beekeepers, and it explains why beekeepers should avoid off-label uses, offers alternate mite management strategies. Off-label use of miticides is not just about resistance management. but it's also about food safety issues as well as worker safety issues. Registered products used according to the label protects products of the hive like wax and honey. The label also protects those that are applying the product, and off-label products don't offer those protections and should be avoided. So Amitraz, I think, is probably one of the more abused products in the commercial beekeeping world. But commercial beekeepers are not the only ones with misuse issues. As an apiary inspector, perhaps the most misused product by backyard beekeepers that I see is oxalic acid. We have one oxalic acid product registered for use in beehives. The product is called apobioxyl. So it comes with the label on how to use it in beehives to kill mites. There are other products with the same active ingredient on the market and readily available at the local hardware store or on Amazon or eBay or wherever that are not registered, and they don't come with instructions on how to safely use in beehives. And these are out of bounds for beekeepers to use, although they are a little cheaper. And so beekeepers do tend to cheat there. As an apiary inspector, one of my goals is to stress to beekeepers the importance of staying on label and making sure they understand what is okay and what isn't. And some of the misuse happening out there at both the commercial and backyard levels are simply because beekeepers are not well informed about what is allowed and what isn't. And so it's important for us to make sure beekeepers understand, what's okay and what's not, and why we need to avoid misuse and stay on label. So it's really quite simple. Avoid misuse inside and outside the hive by using registered products according to the label. Many issues can be avoided by simply using the registered product according to the label, and doing that will maximize effectiveness as well as minimize risk to applicators, products of the hive, off-target species, as well as delay the onset of resistance, extending the useful life of the product, which is important. So these miticides are important in controlling mites, and so it's important that we extend their life as much as possible. If you're a beekeeper, you need help understanding how to properly apply miticides, definitely call on me. I'm happy to help. If you're not a beekeeper and you need help on how to properly use a pesticide, call me. I can put you in touch with an expert that can answer your questions. So don't be shy about calling. We have so many great resources in North Carolina, from Cooperative Extension to NCDA, especially the pesticide guys at NCDA, NCSU apiculture. We have a lot of good resources, and I know that we can find you the help that you need. Just ask and we'll do our best. So with that, I'll stop the share and turn it back over. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Lewis. That was great. And thank you to Hannah and Elsa and Debbie, to all of our presenters, for some really great information. I'm going to put up my slide with everybody's contact information so that you can take a moment and jot down these email addresses. If you have any other questions that you think of maybe after we conclude the webinar today, or something that doesn't get answered, or you just want to have an individual conversation with this person, please write down this information. And before we do questions, I should mention really quickly, I didn't mention it at the beginning, but this Pollinator Field Day, typically we have met at research stations, and we do it usually for a morning or an afternoon, and we have different stations of information. So similar to the presentations that you saw today, each presentation would have been a station, and we break folks out into group, and you rotate among the different stations and learn about pesticide stewardship, or you learn about bee identification. In the past, Hannah has had nets, and people go out into some fields that have been planted with flowers, and you can try to trap bees or butterflies, and we'll help you identify them. Elsa has had a station where she talks about bee biology. Debbie has had a station where she talks about native plants. So it's a really nice opportunity to actually get out into the field and have this hands-on experience. So obviously the last 2 years, we haven't been able to do that, but we still wanted to give you the information. And hopefully if you're interested and you learned a lot, then next year when we do have it back in person, fingers crossed, then you'll be interested in coming out and seeing us there. So now I'm going to go and try to answer some of the questions that were posted in the chat. And the first one is for Debbie. I think you answered this in the chat, but I think I'm going to go ahead and read it out loud so that if folks weren't able to see the answer, they'll know now. Debbie, do you propagate mostly from seed, or do you buy your plants for your pollinator paradise demonstration garden?
Yeah, so we're very fortunate to have some excellent native plant nurseries in the area, which, by the way, are listed on my website and on the handout for the top 25 pollinator plants. So I like to, support our local nurseries. So 99% of the plants in the garden were planted from potted container grown plants. There's one species of native thistle that I wanted to get in the garden that no local nurseries were carrying. So that was one that I did direct seed. But if you have on the website with the list of nurseries, I've also given a link to how to find, native plant nursery in your area, or, ask your cooperative extension office and maybe they can point you to nurseries in your area.
Debbie, I also think on the NC Native Plant Society website, they have a list of all of the nurseries in the state, and I believe they update it pretty regularly, and it has a phone number, and if the folks don't have a phone number, it has an email, and some of them have websites, which is really cool because a lot of our local nurseries now have been doing online sales, or at least online ordering. So they're trying to keep their inventories active, so you can go to their website and see what they currently have, what they might not have until the fall or to the spring. So there's some really good resources out there.
Yeah, that may be the link that I have on I'm looking, because I just put it on there to how to find the nurseries. I think it was the native plant listing. So
okay, perfect.
Okay, good tip.
So the next question, Debbie, is for you also. How often do you find a clone that looks to have great potential as a pollinator plant, but isn't so considered by pollinator species?
Well, I'm not sure how they're using the word clone, but so I've certainly, sometimes it can take pollinators, in my experience in my garden, a while to discover the value of a plant, let's say. So certain plants I've come to appreciate more over time. I'll give you an example, is a wild quinine, Parthenium integrifolium. I first put it in the garden because I thought it was a really cool, unusual flower, and I didn't really think that many pollinators visited it. And Rebecca is another example. But I'm noticing more and more a diversity of species on those. So sometimes it takes time, but I'm not sure I answered your question, but if the person who asked it wants to clarify, I'm not sure if I understood it or not, but.
Okay, yeah, if the person that asked that has additional information, maybe just drop it in the chat and we can circle back to that in just a moment. Okay, so the next question, or the next two questions, are for Hannah and Elsa. So how many of the bees demonstrated today are actually colony nesting species?
I can do that one. And I think there was more in the message that the person who posted the question had it right. Like, most of them are not colony nesters. Of the ones we showed, only the bumblebees were social species that live in a colony that has a queen and a bunch of workers and that kind of division of labor. Most of our wild native bees are solitary. And in that case, there's no division of labor. It's just the female builds her own nest, does all of her own work by herself. And all of the other species, almost all of the other species we showed you were solitary. The exceptions are some of the little sweat bees that we showed you, which do form small social colonies under the ground. Just like they build tunnels in the soil and then their little colony lives in there.
And so, as again to Hannah and Elsa, what are some resources that could be available to our audience if they wanted to learn more about bees, you know, as far as books or websites or anything like that?
There's one more.
Okay, so there's a book that I think is great. It's called The Bees in Your Backyard, which is a great overview of bee biology in general. It's not specific to North Carolina, but if you digest the information in that book, it'll get you a long ways. For local material, Hannah and I did an identification guide to bees of North Carolina, and I will put the link to that in the chat. It's available as a book for purchase from UNC Press or as a free PDF, which if I can get back to my Zoom window, there we go. The link to the free PDF is in the chat there. Hannah, what other resources for learning about bees? There's also a field guide to bees of the Eastern United States coming out next month, which I'm waiting with great anticipation by the same people as the Bees in Your Backyard book. So that'll be a great resource.
Yep, I'm excited about that one too.
Are you?
Like the Flickr page. If people want
Okay,
to.
yeah, sorry, Hannah and I are having a little back channel chat over here. What else are we forgetting? There's another, like the USGS Bee Inventory and Monitoring Lab has an amazing Flickr stream. So I'm gonna pull up the link to that. And then Sam, Sam Droege, the biologist who runs it, writes little blurbs about each of the bees whose photos he posts. So it can be a surprisingly informative place to go learn about bees. And also there's a lot of eye candy. So I'll put a link to that in the chat too in a second.
Great. All right, so this question is for Lewis. Can you comment on products used to control pests, particularly mosquitoes, and how they affect pollinators and the typical homeowner support of that or of those?
I think Debbie posted a nice link in the chat from a recent North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance webinar focused on pollinator-friendly mosquito management. So I think that would probably be a perfect resource.
Okay, yep. So that was a webinar that we did last month, and we had Sydney Ross, also from NCDA, talk quite a bit about mosquito management and different products and their safety and those kinds of things. So that is actually also posted on our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and Google NC Pollinator Conservation Alliance, it should pop right up.
Yeah, and I would also encourage folks to be proactive with mosquitoes instead of reactive. So keep an eye out for places where mosquitoes can breed. Standing water. I have a few places of standing water in my yard, little ponds and whatnot, and I like to use the BT mosquito dunks to prevent reproduction there. And so with all of these things, I think try to think about being proactive instead of reactive.
Yep, that's actually one of the biggest things that I focused on during that presentation. And I think it's especially important, for instance, on days like today, where we've had a couple of days of rain, to walk around your yard and look for areas where water has pooled, because you'd really be surprised some of the places that you wouldn't suspect, you know, old pots or bird baths, or they're collecting water anyways, but little pots that you haven't been using. There's so many different things in your yard that can collect water. And in the presentation, we showed a neat little diagram that pinpoints all of the different areas in your yard where you might potentially have water that can grow mosquitoes. And it only takes a tablespoon of water for mosquitoes to lay eggs. So it's really not much. All right, so Debbie, are there non-native plants that you think are especially beneficial for pollinators?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so about 15% of the plants in my garden are non-native, but some are native to other parts of the US and some are exotic. A lot of the Mediterranean herbs like lavender, thyme, and other herbs like chives are very valuable, especially lavender. My gosh, the Grosso lavender out there blooms months and it attracts a lot of honeybees and bumblebees. The Caloroe species I have 3 different species. The common name is prairie poppy mallow. That attracts, really attractive to bumblebees, especially, and carpenter bees. And so I love that. That's a Midwestern native. One of the very few plants that I mail ordered is, we'll see, what's the common name? prairie clover, Dalea purpurea and Dalea candida, purple prairie clover. Awesome plant. And again, if you go to my website and look at the what's in bloom, that's how you'll see that. Or if you follow me on social media, I've got pictures of it, but that's especially loved by the bumblebees. And it's just a really neat plant. Ornamental oregano, I love. Again, lots of butterflies, bumblebees, and honeybees on that. Yeah, there's quite a few. Yeah, especially the herbs and some of the agastaches that I have that are not native, like the blue fortune or the Agastache rupestris, great for hummingbirds as well as your larger bodied bees like bumblebees and carpenter bees. If you look at the list of, if you go to my website and download the list of plants in the garden, not the top 25, but all of them, I show which are native to North Carolina or other parts of the US or exotic.
Okay. All right. So I guess this next question is probably going to be pointed to Hannah and Elsa. Which native bee species in the Piedmont are under greatest threat, and what can we do or plant to help them?
So I can start this one. Oh, sorry, hold on. Okay, good. I can start this one and then Elsa will take over if I forget anything, but I'll start by saying that the problem is, just like Lewis just said, that bee research has been more reactive. So there's a lot that we don't know still, and a lot of the research that's been done is because there was an obvious problem. So a lot of native bee populations, we don't know what their historical distributions were. We have some idea, but it could be just what is in museums, which might not be accurate. So throwing it out there, there's a lot we don't know, which makes it hard to know what species are in peril, what we need to help, because we don't know what it used to be like. But what we do know is that there's a couple bumblebee species that are, some people want to list them as threatened. There was one, the rusty patch bumblebee, that was actually listed as endangered a couple years ago. But the American bumblebee, Debbie showed a picture of it earlier, there's a movement to have that listed as threatened. So bumblebees are easier to study, so we know more about them, and that's why we have some species that we know are in trouble. But there's a lot of species that we don't have enough research on to even know if they are in trouble. So I would say if a bee is rare, or if it's a specialist where it needs a certain type of flower, those are ones that probably need extra attention, because if that flower is not there, that bee won't be there either. And then what can we do or plant? So of course, Debbie's plant list is a great place to start, and just keep building from there. And then, like we mentioned, that there's a lot of different places that bees nest. So underground, in wood, in stems, and also cavities. So trying to provide a diversity of those resources for bees. So we can't pave everything, we can't mulch everything. We need to have a mixture of resources available to them so that we can support as many bees and as many kinds of bees in our efforts.
I just added to the chat a link to Jared Fowler's website, who's compiled a list of plants used by specialist bees in the Eastern US. So that's another resource if you're wanting to, you've got your basic pollinator garden that's feeding a lot of generalists, and you want to try and expand the reach and the types of bees that supports, you might go through that list and see if there's anything there that you can add that would support some of the bees that might not recognize every plant as potential food.
All right, next question. And I see also that you had put something in the chat, but so solitary bee hotels, helpful, not helpful? What's the scoop?
They are, the jury's still a little bit out. There's plenty of research, especially in agricultural areas, showing that bee populations do tend to increase over time when they're provided with these extra nesting resources. But it's still fairly limited research. There's one great example showing that not only does the number of bees in the hotel increase, because who knows what that really means for the broader population. This was a study in blueberry fields showing that after nesting resources were added, just the number of bees even foraging in those fields also increased. It'll take more evidence over a longer amount of time to really say absolutely this is helpful and it increases bee populations. Potential downsides include that there are some non-native species that will also happily occupy bee hotels. And if they're not well maintained, they can kind of become death traps where they accumulate parasites and diseases. So if it's well maintained, as I have not found any information yet that would make me think this is a bad idea. I think it's still great to put them up, and it's a great opportunity to sort of get to know your bee neighbors. And it's a good chance to observe them as long as you're kind of following best practices and maintaining it so that it doesn't fill up with parasites and diseases. And I did put a link in the chat to a document in progress that a colleague and I are working on to kind of lay out some of those best practices for how to really have the best shot of doing conservation with your bee hotel.
And Elsa, can you, since we have a few extra minutes, can you just talk briefly about using an emergence box? Because, you know, the principle of changing out the tubes or the rods in the bee hotel, and how do you do that? Because where's the stop and the start from different bees?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question, because in order to maintain a bee hotel, you need to take out old nesting material and replace it with fresh nesting material. But at no time of year can you take nesting material out and be sure that it is empty, that you wouldn't be throwing away bees when you do that, because everybody's life cycle is a little bit different, and some bees might emerge in March and start new nests, and others might do so in July. So when do you swap things out? And the emergence box that Gabriella mentioned is that sort of key missing link that lets you empty out your nesting material before you throw it away. And it's just usually a wooden box that has sort of a bee-sized hole in it. And you would take your old nesting material out of the bee hotel and put it in the emergence box and the bees, and then you just keep it, you know, somewhere that it is experiencing the seasons. Don't keep it indoors. It could be maybe in a shed for the winter, or just leave it on the same post as your bee hotel. And then when the bees in that nesting material hit the right point in the season, they'll come out, they'll see the light in that one little bee-sized hole, they'll leave, but that's no longer an attractive place to recolonize. So when they look for a new nesting material, by that point, you will have put new, you know, fresh materials in your original bee hotel, and they will hopefully recolonize that, and they won't go back in the old materials. And then after those have been sitting out for a year, then you can compost them or throw them away or do whatever you're going to do with them.
That's really good information. I find sometimes that when I am reading about bee hotels, I don't see as much information about the emergence box. So it talks about replacing out the material, but then how do you compensate for the different times of season that the bees are nesting? So that's really good information. All right, Debbie, how did the rock soil bare ground area that you put in your garden, how did that do, or how is that working right now?
I'm getting ready to show a picture of that. That's a great question. Let's see, one second. Hang on. Oh, there we go. Can y'all see that?
Yep.
Oh, whoopsie daisy. So I as Elsa was saying, you know, it's important in pollinator habitat to have nesting areas for bees, and the majority of our native bees are ground nesting. So I experimentally wanted to try to create artificial ground nesting habitat, totally experimental basis. I had seen where this was done intentionally, like in Utah. I'd seen a little bit of research where they said that bees did well nesting among rocks. So on this area, we have we created an herb garden on this slope and removed the plants and the mulch and exposed the soil, and then I placed rocks there. So this was a few years ago. To date, we have not had any ground nesting bees, but I'm not dissuaded yet, because if I've learned nothing from pollinator gardening, it's that patience can pay off. Now, this may never attract any ground nesting bees, but I figured it was attractive, at least. And wouldn't it be awesome if I could get, bees to nest right there? Because I can tell you, as an extension agent, I get a lot of calls in the spring from freaked out homeowners who are pouring gasoline down the holes of bees trying to kill them. They're worried about their kids getting stung because they're seeing, dozens or hundreds of bees, hovering over the lawn, and they don't understand that they're solitary bees and that they're not yellow jackets. They're not going to exhibit defensive behavior. So far it hasn't attracted any that I've noticed, but I haven't given up. So I'm just going to keep, right now it's covered in passion flower vines because, the typical bees that would utilize it, like the andrenid bees and, Anthophora, they would have already made their nest. So if they haven't done it yet, they're not going to do it this season. So I've let it kind of be overrun with passion flower vine. So I'll let you know, it's an ongoing experiment. I've got them on opposite sides of the sidewalk facing, different orientations. So far nothing, but it looks good.
And Debbie, to that point, I know you've mentioned more than once that, you had planted some things to attract pipevine swallowtails, and it was years, right, before you got them, but now you're getting them. So I think the essence of patience, that's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a viburnum prunifolium that I remember I waited 8 years before I ever saw a bloom. I waited 5 years before the pipevine bloomed, and 5 years before it attracted a pipevine swallowtail. So sometimes you just gotta wait and see. I can't explain why it takes so long sometimes, but there's nothing, nothing wrong with leaving it. And if anything, I could always revert it back to plants if I wanted to, but I'm fine leaving it as rocks. Maybe one day we'll get lucky. We'll have a pioneering bee come in and decide that was a perfect place. I think it would be so awesome to be able to stand there with a tour group amongst these bees flying around on either side of us, and people can see that there's nothing to be fearful of,
Yeah. Can you, Debbie, talk for a minute too, because you mentioned this a couple of times, and I know I see a lot of pictures of your volunteers and yourself working a lot doing maintenance of the garden, because I think there's this misconception, and maybe it's on a larger scale landscape, but there's a misconception that you plant pollinator habitat and then you can walk away and it's going to do its own thing. And maybe you can just shed some light on that. There are a lot of native things that are more aggressive than others, and it doesn't make them invasive. It just, they're doing their thing and they're seeding, and sometimes you have to spend a lot of time pulling out the things that you don't want to allow room for the things that you do want.
Well, the key phrase you said there, Gabriella, was they will do their own thing, and by golly, they will. And it may not be what you want them to do. So when I'm giving my tours, I always talk about, identify the particular natives that are very aggressive or spready, not invasive, because native plants can't technically be invasive. And they do require a lot of management. Now, you don't have to manage them. I talk about the difference between a designed garden and a natural area. So, if you carefully design your garden where you want the plants to be in a certain place and, combinations that you want, and you want to keep it that way, it's going to require management. Because, for example, if you've got that golden Alexander in there, it's going to seed in everywhere, and it's going to grow in the same hole as a coneflower, and it's going to outcompete it. So you have to decide if you want to let everything duke it out on its own, and that's fine. And it will change over time, and over 5 years, it may resemble nothing like what you originally planted. And to be honest, I've let a few of my outlying beds do that. It's really kind of fascinating to watch. I've got many different beds in the garden, and so there's certain beds where the eastern horsemint or the frost aster, which I no longer plant in a mixed planting because it's such a thug, or obedient plant or whatever has taken over. So as a gardener, you have to decide, do you want to let nature take its course? And it's really interesting to watch that play out. Or do you want to put a little more time in it and keep it closer to what you want? And I've done both. I practice both of those methods at the garden. And the good news about, we do spend a lot of time removing aggressive plants. The good news is I get to share them with my volunteers. Yeah.
All right, well, I don't see any more questions in the chat. This recording is going to be made available within the next week or so when we can get it posted to our YouTube channel. And once that happens, then I will send out one more Eventbrite email to let you know that it has been posted with the link. And also because we had so many links in the chat to lots of different really good resources, I'm going to I've copied all of these, and I'll also include that in an email so that if you didn't get a chance to download or copy some of these links, that you will see that. Oh, and Madison from North Carolina Wildlife Federation, she just posted in the chat that the NC Wildlife Federation has a general native plant bloom calendar with prospective bloom times for several native herbaceous plants, shrubs, and trees. So I will also catch that link and include it with the list of links that I'm going to send everybody. So going once, going twice, any last questions before we let everybody go? And like I said, I left up that last slide. Hopefully you got a chance to write down everybody's contact information. So if you did have a question or something came to you after the webinar concludes, you can reach out to that person individually and have your question answered. So with that, thanks everybody. Thanks to our presenters so much. Debbie, thanks to you for hosting us, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Oh, I'm gonna save the chat, Gabriella.
Oh, good. Okay, because I copied and pasted it, but saving it was better. Perfect.
Thank you.